Enjoy.
Thanks so much, Marie, for the invitation. I'm sure you're all exhausted after an entire day of talks, and I'm going to exhaust you more. So I'm Chris. The title of the talk is called An Archaeology of the Arts, Sciences, and Politics of Immersion, 4 Models. Now, this term immersion is everywhere in the arts. But instead of just showing you artworks that you could see on Instagram, I decided to ask some more critical questions. And I'm going to start with these questions. One is, what is this term immersion? What does it signify as an aesthetic, as a cultural, or as an effective concept? How does it operate? Like, how do you make immersive stuff? How does it span different genres of practice, different contexts, different disciplines, from the fine arts, art history, or even sociology? And since I also teach, or I'm interested in pedagogy, how is it taught? What knowledge does it produce? So that's both pedagogical, but it's also a question about research. What knowledge do you make that's new in the world? So I'm Chris Salter. I'm an artist and research professor for Immersive Arts and Director of the Immersive Arts Space at the Zurich University of the Arts, the ZHdK. This is the ZHdK. It's the largest art school in Switzerland, one of the largest in Europe. Before that, and this is the Immersive Arts Space. I'll talk about this more in a second. It's a very large space. What do we do in that? I'll tell you more. Before that, I was 16 years in Montreal, Canada, at Concordia University, where I started and or co-founded and also ran various labs at different scales, all of them dealing with the relationship between art, science, technology, and design and digital culture. These develop projects between cultural institutions like MUTEK or Electro or Ars Electronica or many others, as well as training students. So I wear a lot of different hats. I wear the hat of an artist, an academic, a scholar, and a director, a research director. And the talk is going to kind of go back and forth, so just be prepared. So these are the different settings in Canada. And then along the way, I kind of make some artworks. These are kind of projects that all deal with the question of the entanglement of human sensation, sense-making with technical systems and environments. They all involve the question of how our bodies are transformed by these technologies that we think are on screens, but actually are around us and surrounding us. And also along the way, I wrote a couple books. And these books are interesting as an artist for me because I can think through questions and issues that you can't do in artworks. So, for instance, this is Entangled, Technology, the Transformation of Performance. These are all done for the MIT Press. This is a book about the history of technology and performance from the end of the 19th century to 2008. This is a book called Alien Agency that deals with how artists work with responsive matter and stuff. And then this is the most recent book, which is a trade book. This is not written for an academic audience. It's written for a very broad public on how machine and human sensing are increasingly meshing together. And this book is partly inspiring this talk. So I'm going to do two things. I'm going to talk first about 4 different ways of thinking about immersion. So I just prepare you. This is very art historical and somewhat academic, but there's a lot of images. Second of all, I want to talk about very practically what we're doing in Zurich as maybe a way of framing some of the historical work and critical questions that I'm going to talk about. So the immersive arts, so what could we call that? Well, let's start with a definition. It's a catch-all term for a genre of contemporary art practices that utilizes technological apparatuses and setups to immerse visitors. What do we think about immerse? Well, immerse means we're in water, we're surrounded. Or if we want to go further, we lose the sense of something. We lose the sense of the boundaries of ourself in relationship to the space, the environment that we're in. And so, and how we do this is we try to merge the physical and the digital, the computational. Now, this is a big debate. Rosalind Krauss, famous US art historian, says that immersive artworks are works that forego history in the name of a kind of intensity of experience. And Brian Eno says that artworks are no longer objects on walls, but actually triggers for your experience. So this question of experience is very much tied to this question of immersion. So, but you can see that there's no set upon definition. This is a contested term, and it's continually being revised based on political, historical, economic, and artistic circumstances, as you're going to see. It very much aligns with a very old idea from Walter Benjamin from 1935, where he said the manner in which our human sense perception is organized, the medium in which it takes place, is not just natural, it's determined by historical circumstances. And you're going to see this, I think, very quickly in the talk. So here are some classic examples of what we might call immersive arts. The light artist James Turrell, Yayoi Kusama's Infinity Room. These are quite interesting to me because people stand in line for up to 6 or 7 hours to spend 30 seconds in this space. Kusama's interested in the obliteration of the self. It's hard to obliterate the self in 30 seconds. This is Team Lab, which you probably know. And then this is, of course, how many people know immersive art is this kind of immersive Van Gogh. There's many artists, Frida Kahlo, Matisse, and so on. But this is also immersion. Will immersive experience revitalize the dying US mall? And then this is also immersion, which of course you've probably heard about, the Sphere in Las Vegas. So we have U2 playing in front of this massive screen. So how do we get there? Well, let's look at, first of all, the kind of origin of some of these concepts. And it starts in the 1960s with Lucy Lippard, who's 80 years old now. Lucy Lippard was a famous art historian, but also Oscar Massota, a Argentinian writer, both at the same time came up with this idea of thinking about how artworks were dematerializing, how the object was disappearing. This is her famous book, 6 Years, The Dematerialization of the Art Object from 1966 to 1972. So basically, land art, performance art, earth art, systems-oriented art, this was all taking place at the same time. And you can think about immersion in a very interesting way through the lens of Alan Capro. So Capro was an important post-war visual artist, and he was proposing what was called happenings, right? So this is the famous 18 Happenings in 6 parts, 1959. Basically, Capro was interested in this idea of a kind of pan-artistic phenomena that would cross across borders of artistic works and lead to unusual places. And at one point in an interview, someone asked Capro, what is this happening thing? What do you mean? And he says, go in instead of look at. So that was his idea, that the happening was no longer something you could look at from a distance, but that you would actually be in it. Now, this did not fit very well with particularly a lot of white male critics. For instance, like Michael Fried, an important art critic in the 1960s to the 1990s. Fried wrote a famous book called Art and Objecthood, and he discussed 2 core ideas, which are, I think, very interesting as lenses to understand kind of contemporary immersive work. One is this idea of absorption. And what Fried said was the beholder, the perceiver of the artwork, should be pushed out of the artwork. Now, Fried was talking about 17th century painting. He was saying that in 17th century painting, you have this particular way the landscape is organized. So you cannot enter into it as a viewer. It takes time. You have to look at the artwork, and it takes time to find your way into it. But then Fried contrasts this idea of immersion, or let's say absorption, later with this concept of what he calls theater or theatricality. So theatricality was art that escaped the boundaries of sculpture and painting and essentially became part of a situation that included the beholder, i.e. the audience, okay? Now, he was basically, this idea of theater was very much a critique of people like John Cage, who wanted to dissolve the borders between painting, sculpture, performance, and the environment itself, and actually everyday life. But it's not just Cage, it's also artists, for instance, like Ligia Pop, Brazilian artist. This is a recreation of Devisor from 1968, because you can see the Cartier store there. But she was very also interested in this kind of event where basically the public, the audience makes the event. Now, Capro was not particularly interested, in fact, in even the notion of an audience. He wanted to get rid of that. He said he was probably more interested in the way interaction would take place between participants in a situation and the situation itself, that those participants would make that situation. And he said, all the elements, people, space, materials, and character of the environment, and even time can be integrated together. And that was why he was very interested in this notion of happening. Now, Capra wasn't particularly interested in the technological surrounds we have today, but I think this is a very important idea that all these elements are key to the artwork, not just what you see, but actually the entire situation that you're involved in when you experience something like works here, for instance. Okay, so now we go to model 2. And this is probably the way we mostly understand immersion, which is the media surround to perform the future. Now, this is Las Vegas, 2023. Las Vegas is, of course, a parched desert using up all of the water supply of the Colorado River in order to power this. This is the Sphere. And it's the brainchild of this New York billionaire, James Dolan, who owns Madison Square Garden and the New York Knicks, but also is more famous for actually using facial recognition technologies to keep people suing him out of his sports arenas. Now, the Sphere is really big. You can see it's really big. It's 366 feet in comparison to the Statue of Liberty, which is a measly 305 feet, and the Seattle Space Needle, which is 600 feet, and the Washington Monument, and the Pyramids of Giza, which is 449 feet. So the Sphere is close to the Pyramids of Giza. It has, let's see, I'll give you statistics, 110 meters, 16 by 16K interior LED screen measuring 160,000 square feet, 45,000 square meter exterior LED screen that has 1 million LEDs, a sound processing system with 167,000 speaker drivers, and on and on and on. But it's not a new idea to overwhelm us as humans with an environment, a surround. Etienne Boulet, French architect who never built anything, created this paper vision of the cenotaph, the tomb for instance, Isaac Newton in 1784. And then you can go to panoramas in the 19th century. This is 1801 in London, in Leicester Square. Panoramas were very important because they would surround the viewer with these almost high, this is not high resolution, but high resolution images surrounding them. And what was very interesting is that these ideas of surrounding oneself in media carry on into the 1950s and 1960s. This is the Brussels Expo, 1958, the Atomium, which you can still see. You can still go up into it and have dinner. This is the World's Fair in New York, 1964. Notice all these works have something in common, these World's Fairs. They have the image of the Earth, the globe, as some kind of unifying principle, which today seems a fantasy. This is Montreal, 1967, again, the Sphere of Buckminster Fuller, and then this is Osaka in 1970. Now, these World's Fairs were extremely important because they gave you a glimpse of the future. This is where people went to see the future at the time. The art historian Carolyn Jones says that these global World's Fairs were about infrastructures of spectacle, and they aimed to basically put citizens into a kind of course, mostly men, into a narrative of man's universal progress in this sense. So these were very much about nation building, and so the idea was that basically nations would put basically these pavilions up to show how advanced they were technologically and aesthetically. Now let's take Montreal, the most important one, Terre des Hommes, Man in His World, 1967. Now, what's very interesting is that this was held in the context of Canada coming basically onto the world stage. It still was a very important expo for many of my colleagues, older colleagues in Canada. But of course, not everything was well. This is the Indigenous Pavilion that demonstrated that Canada was actually, of course, a colonial construction. And then at the same time, there was unrest in the streets because of Quebec liberation, famous speech from Charles de Gaulle that basically said, Vive de le Québec libre during this period. So at the same time in Expo 67, you had these pavilions that demonstrated the immersive future of projection. This is Labyrinth from basically Roman Kreuter, who's one of the founders of IMAX, and Colin Lowe, where you move from space to space in the Labyrinth. And this is the Czech pavilion partly designed by the Czech scenographer Josef Svoboda, who's one of the most important scenographers. Most people don't know his work, but this is one of my favorite pieces. Of course, I didn't see this. I was born in that year. But this is the Dia Polyekran, literally the multiple screen slideshow. And I wanted to show you this as a clip. This was run on a computer tape of 167,000 instructions with a machine that would move these boxes back and forth, and each box had 2 slide projectors, and we can see this here. This is in Czech, so maybe just push the volume up a little bit. Thanks. So here's the apparatus. These things move backwards and forwards based on the spectacle.
Celé toto zařízení o váze takřka 10 tun bylo navrženo a zkonstruováno československými odborníky. Pro 15-minutový program je v automatickém zařízení zakódováno 5 300 000 informací.
A tohle hrůzostrašné technické monstrum dostal do ruky režisér Emil Radok, který z více než 12 000 diapozitivů sestavil velice působivý program, nazvaný případně Stvoření světa.
So this was basically a 10-minute like performance with no humans. There's a slideshow of a very sophisticated kind demonstrating or talking about the birth of the world. And then you can see that the relief changes on these pixels in time. Now, of course, today this is easy to control, but just imagine having to do this in 1967 with a computer tape, not a programming, not a screen, but basically a punch tape. And then you had also one of the most important works in the French pavilion, and that was the work of Jan Xenakis, the Polytope de Montréal, which was Xenakis' idea of a kind of virtual sound and light environment. And these projects are very important to me because in 2011, in Laboral in Spain, we kind of reimagined these works, and we toured that kind of re-envisioning of Polytope for a number of years. But watch this. This is also analog-controlled 1700 flashes in this structure.
Cette musique lumineuse est accompagnée d'une musique sonore qui est distribuée par 4 pistes magnétiques dans tout l'espace environnant et composée à partir d'instruments de l'orchestre classique, mais traités non pas artificiellement avec toutes sortes de moyens électroniques, mais le traitement en soi des instruments est tout à fait spécial et nouveau.
Vous croyez, comme Bruno Maderna, que les instruments traditionnels peuvent garder toute
So you can
leur
see
place
the
dans la
kind of
musique
scale at
Bien
which
sûr, à condition de savoir
people
s'en
like
servir.
Xenakis were working with.
Si on s'en sert d'une
Okay, and then you have spheres everywhere. So the Montreal Fuller Dome, and then Expo 70 in Osaka, where Stockhausen had 60 speakers. I mean, now you have hundreds of thousands of speakers, but in 1970, you had this experience of this spherical dome. So, and that's, of course, the sphere now. You can see how it would be quite amazing to reduce U2 down to that tiny scale in the midst of this information deluge. All right, so what's interesting is that, as you can see from that last image, the sphere in Las Vegas very much positions immersion, maybe less in the sense of like new kind of perceptual experience, but certainly part of what we call the attention economy. So the attention economy is very much based on this book by Pine and Gilmore, 2 Harvard Business School scholars, who in the 1990s defined this idea that experience would be the next, essentially, way of essentially making money. So here's good examples. Here's, of course, Kusama again, but Kusama can also be translated into Louis Vuitton. And Oliver Eliasson's Weather Project, which, of course, was a kind of phenomenological experience for many people at the Tate, in 2003 can also be translated also to Louis Vuitton again. So it's very interesting because Anna Wiener wrote a very interesting article in the New Yorker in 2002, asked about what is this immersive art? How is it arisen? What is it tied to? And it's quite interesting because Mark Glimsher, who's the head of Pace Gallery, said, the churches are emptying and artists are trying to fill the gap. But what's interesting is that Glimsher also said that immersive art are new forms of financial assets. Now that was before COVID. So we have, of course, this is, I think, a very prototypical image running around, inside a Monet. But critics were not so taken by immersion. So Hal Foster, again, an American art historian, said there's a problem with this, and there's an ideological problem with it. He says, you are lost in relation to your body, and you stumble not only into the work, but through it as well. It's an effect beyond distraction, it's disorientation, it's being lost in space, and one has to wonder about these ideological effects of these works. Now, how do you explain this? Well, one way to explain it is McLuhan, right? The idea that actually technology is simply us. We are extensions. Media, as he said, is extensions of us. Technologies are extensions of ourselves and our senses and our brain out into the world. But another way of thinking about these is more sophisticated, I think. And this is from the French critic Jacques Rancière, who talks about the politics of aesthetics. And he says that politics is really about how the senses are made able to make sense of things. He says that politics is about making things sayable, knowable, hearable, and doable. Politics revolves around what is seen and what can be said about it, around who has the ability to speak and see, and the possibility of space, properties of space, and the possibilities of time. So it's very interesting, this question about who has the ability to speak is being tested, as we know, right now across the world because of political situations. And so it's interesting in the sense that Rancière says, like, the regime of what he calls the sensible is key. So if you think about, let's say, a phenomenon like generative AI, not as a technology, but as a cultural form, it's completely aesthetic. Robots, you see GPT-3, or GPT, you see whatever text coming, you're confronted by images from these machines. We're continually surrounded by machines challenging what we think is knowable or sayable or doable. And that links to my last idea, which is the idea of information within a space, immersion as a space of information. Now, what's interesting is this gets us to what really is the core of, like, we're in KIKK, which is dealing with digital culture. Any festival around the world is dealing with eventually this tension between computing, a highly abstract mathematical idea, and human experience. And this is exacerbated in the 1960s when, let's say, computing starts to become a dominant force in economy. I'm not saying the personal computer, but the computer, of course, becomes the tool of war and the tool of military research. So on the one side, in the 1950s, 1960s, you have this relentless drive for computing. And that meant not only computers as machines, but also humans imagined as those computers, that the brain itself was a computer and so on. At the same time, you had the 60s counterculture of artists and hippies and dropouts and intellectuals who wanted to use those machines to challenge these authoritative forms that were happening. They were after almost a kind of spiritual quest. So there were new ways of conceptualizing the relation between aesthetics, politics, and perception in the relationship to the viewer. And these terms, information, feedback, control, interaction, became not only terms from science, but also terms used in the arts. So for instance, this is Gruppo T, one of the Italian interactive groups who are interested in what they call the kind of works in becoming. This is a very simple but actually extremely effective work. You're in a room with these lights, you trigger a sensor, the light turns on, there are mirrors, you see yourself in the mirror, but you see others just briefly. This is what Umberto Eco called the open work, works that were not already fixed and finished. And then here's Gabriele De Vecchi, another Italian artist. I just saw this in Milan. There's reconstructions of all these works in the Musée Novecento. This is very, very simple, but it also alters your perception of space just by changing essentially this perspective. And so these works, this is Grazia Varisco, these works were all about trying to change the viewer's relationship to space and time. And then people like Robert Rauschenberg, who of course was known for his combines, these mixed media works, was also one of the progenitors of essentially what we might even call art and technology. He was involved with the founding of Experiments in Art and Technology in New York. He participated in exhibitions across in LA and so on. So interaction and feedback were key, but also the key of information. So cybernetics influenced that, but also this idea of information. And part of this was because Shannon in the 40s came up with this idea of information is quantifiable, that information is a signal between a sender and a receiver, and then there's noise that enters into that. That influenced artists enormously. So for instance, Ray and Charles Eames' studio very much focused on this idea of information. This is glimpses of the USA in the National Exhibition in Moscow. If you can even imagine today, a culture exchange between Russia and the United States. And what the Eames were very interested in is like you just see like how patterns emerge, essentially, and how out of a huge amount of information, a pattern, the human brain can detect patterns, which is very similar to what we call today deep neural networks. You can see here in this 20-minute show, this tension between all this flows of information and how the human brain makes sense of them. And this is, for instance, think in the IBM Pavilion 1964, also not about what these images are really meaning, but about how they come in time and in space. So it's, as my friend Oren Halpern says, it's a kind of field of perception that the brain and the body has to deal with. And this makes sense because this was sponsored by IBM. IBM was interested in seeing how humans and machines were similarly alike. And finally, you had the Electronic Visualization Lab in the 1970s. They developed technologies for human-computer interaction, as well as the visualization with Larry Cuba, who was a computer artist for Star Wars, first one in 1977. But they also developed the Cave in 1999. And this is very interesting because the Cave, now today, many people forgot what this thing is, but the Cave was very much this surround environment with projection, and it would basically stimulate the viewer and suspend their disbelief. I'm going to skip that because you know it, but you probably don't know that image. This is from 1968, this idea of immersion coming from looking through into a mathematical world through a head-mounted display. If anyone's bought an Oculus Quest, 3 or 2, you can do this, but this was Yvonne Sutherland, the founder of essentially what we call augmented or virtual reality, of which the computer imposes a mathematical model onto the real world. And I want to finish, before I talk about the Immersive Arts Space in the last 10 minutes, to think about what this means. What kind of knowledge, for instance, in the Cave, a space which was meant for scientific visualization, what does that do to the bodies of those people in that space? And Natasha Myers and Joe Dumit, two anthropologists who did a study of how scientists work in the Cave, said that these spaces increase the degrees of freedom for researchers to scale and rescale data in real time. This is not just a practice of placing objects in different relation to human durations and dimensions. It is one that allows researchers to transform their bodily capacities and refigure what they can say, see, feel, and know. So in other words, it's not simply that a body is inside this information space, it's that the space actually reconfigures what we can know about it and ourselves. Okay, so that's a lot, I know. So you can ask me later, take lots of pictures. But what is this in practice? So the Immersive Arts Space in Zurich, so now I'm trying to think, I just took this job a year ago, trying to think, okay, what is immersion out in a critical way that both produces work but also tries to reflect on it? So the Immersive Arts Space is a cross-departmental lab for teaching, research, and production in the immersive arts. That's the space without anything in it. There's a team of research associates, MA graduates from the ZHdK. They have expertise in computer science and interaction design, and computer music, and media art, and production, and film, computer science, and so on. And it's funded by this digital initiative of the Zurich University. It's a very large-scale technology-centric funding for 10 years to try to examine what are these new forms of reality, extended reality that are emergent, while at the same time trying to critically, socially reflect on these practices. Just show you very quickly, this was last semester. So this is very kind of, there's lots of stuff going on. Some of these are student projects. Some are artist residencies. We did with Pro Helvetia, an Argentinian artist, young Argentinian artist came. So there's a range of different things. It functions really as a kind of production platform, but also, as I said, research. And we also do some amount of teaching. This was Joaquina Salgado from Argentina, who was working with game engines and live, was very interested in the kind of aesthetics of game engine with live sound. This is workshops with motion capture with BA acting students. This is kind of demo evenings called Lab Insights, where we test projects before we kind of put them out outside of the ZHdK in the world. And then there's a range of education projects. These are classes on volumetric light, on tracking objects, on a system called Cinedesk, which is a visualization system using Unreal Engine 5, and so on. So you have this quite wide range of activities. So it's both a physical site that involves many high-level technologies, but it's also a conceptual site to question those technologies. So it has a double function. It's what the sociologist, anthropologist Lucy Suchman calls a kind of configuration. On the one side, the technologies materialize a kind of imaginary, and on the other side, those imaginaries narrate the significance of those technologies. So these things go hand in hand. And so we're producing academic work, we're producing artistic work, and we're producing tools both for artists and scientists. Right now, we're focused on spatial computing as a model for computational reason. How do machines organize space and activities of the body? This is a project right now called Reconfigure, which was just in Linz, and now is actually running as I speak in Zurich for the Zurich Digital Arts Festival Zurich, and will be shown other places. This is where you take a scan of the human body, take a 2D image, and then using a quite sophisticated pipeline, map that onto a 3D avatar within a span of 10 seconds, and then embed that avatar into a kind of world of ghost-like figures, which are, of course, you as the audience. So, for instance, you can see you lose gravity. People have this very strange experience of seeing themselves, but of course, how the machine sees you. So you see all the mistakes of the machine, and people just talking to people, they felt like their own sense of gravity. They was losing their own sense of their body in space, and so on. So this is quite interesting because it deals with, of course, this kind of neural network-based volumetric capture, but it also very much plays with this tension between yourself as an individual in relation to a collective. This is where all these bodies then somehow form this kind of singularity. We're doing work on the proxemics of distance between social and intimate distance. We're doing work now, in 2 weeks, you can check it out online. There's the Refresh Festival curated between the Immersive Arts Space and the Department of Design. This is a professional festival, it's not a student festival. The Immersive Arts Space is working on a text from 1922 by Klebnikov, a Russian futurist poet, which is very interesting because it deals with, half of it's in a made-up language called Zaum, beyond sense, and so it's very interesting to deal with language now in a world, and it's of course the piece is about a world of language, how language makes the world in a world of conflict. It was written in the 1920s, right after the Russian Revolution. And then we're starting work on a very large-scale project called Probing XR's Futures, funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, and we're asking 3 questions. How does extended reality reshape subjectivity, interaction, and experience in action? How disabled bodies reshape XR's normative vision of bodies, because XR VR is extremely able-bodied. If you can't stand, it's very difficult to calibrate the system. If you don't have hands, you can't hold these controllers. If you have arthritis, if you can't move your head, there's huge amounts of issues around this, so we're trying to understand how disabled bodies can shape these systems versus the other way around, and then how can bodily experience, singular and plural, be brought as a kind of critical inquiry. All right, in the last 3 minutes, I'm just going to jump through 3 core ideas. about working with immersive technologies. The first is this idea of technological thinking. So what we're trying to figure out is how do specific contexts, methods, histories, and practices that underpin a technology, whether that be generative AI or virtual reality or motion capture, how do those concepts establish specific ways of perceiving with those technologies, and how can we engage with them in that context? So sociology of science asks questions like, what is a technology? Is it socially shaped? Do technological artifacts like software and hardware have politics? What are the common mistakes in thinking about technology? And we're trying to think about that in artistic terms. The second is what Philip Agri called critical technical practice, where one foot is in critique and the other foot is in design. And Agri basically says there are value propositions that are tied into every single technology, and so we have to question the metaphors that make up those technologies. And the last idea is what I call complexity literacy, which is not systems that are complex, like complicated, but systems that behave, interact in let's say, indeterminate ways that are random, that follow local rules, that involve emergence and collective dynamics. And we just had a meeting yesterday as we're developing curriculum for an interdepartmental minor. The whole ZHdK will switch to these minor systems, so we'll train students in a one-year minor. We had a long meeting about how do we, in very short periods of time, how do we convey this kind of technological thinking, this kind of literacy to these students. So the conclusion, technologies are not neutral, and they are cultural. They are embedded as part of the ways in which culture is shaped, formed, and changed. The second is we can't understand technologies in isolation, but as part of an entire system. This goes back again to the 60s. Jack Burnham wrote a famous article called Systems Aesthetics, where he said we're moving from objects to systems in the arts, and that will transform how we perceive the aesthetic experience. So these media technologies are not in isolation. They're part of a system of interacting parts, and the interactions cannot be known in advance. And the last idea is a really important one for Michael Century, who's a Canadian media theorist and also worked in policy in the 1990s in Canada. He gave away money to the kinds of things that now have quite long trajectories in Canada, in the new media industries, and in both education and culturally. He says that artists work in what he calls an alternative technological ethos, a common way of apprehending technology as malleable, as open to revision through its use, and subject to both conceptual and functional reimaginings. What does that mean? It means that artists already know how to twist technologies before or even during their kind of, the way they then get solidified by essentially limited corporate visions. So this, of course, relates back to an old idea from McLuhan, where McLuhan said artists are part of a distant early warning system because they are the ones that can detect the social changes that are taking place before others. Thanks very much.